step number one, to admit your need. It takes humility to admit our needs because the pride of life is one of the evils of this age, 1 John 2 tells us. We know that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And when we hide our problems and our sin, things get worse. In Psalm 32, David talked about how that God was bringing him conviction and he hid his sin and he resisted God. And he said he just got into a terrible state until he finally turned around and said, God, I need to confess what I'm doing. I told you earlier that when God would come and speak to me, he wanted to set me free, but I was operating in fear. Fear of him and fear of pain and fear of further problems. And so I kept pushing God away. And so I wasn't admitting my need. I know that sounds silly, but it's really a powerful first step. Somebody once came to me and said, oh, I love your teaching about the steps to release. My Uncle Harry needs this. You should share this with my Uncle Harry. And I say, well, is your Uncle Harry a Christian? Oh, no. Would he listen to what I'm saying? Oh, no, he couldn't care anything about the Bible. Well, I can't start. I can't begin to help him. He's closed his heart, closed his eyes. He will not admit his need. Testimony that might give you some clue. Many years ago, I went down to the South Island of New Zealand, and I was staying as a missionary team. We'd gone on travels around the place, and we'd gone to a little place up near Milford Sound, on the way up toward Milford Sound. And I was staying in a little tiny town, and there was a lovely old lady in the church who had offered to take the different people in the church. So they went to different houses, and I went to the home of this little old lady. She put on a nice dinner for me and everything else. And I sat and asked her a bit about her story. And I said, what happened to your husband? She said, well, it's very sad. She said, the ladies in the church had all decided that they were going to go down to Invercargill, and then from Invercargill you take a ferry to a place called Stewart Island, which is an island off the bottom end of the big island in New Zealand. And we were having a day trip, and we were going to have a lovely time. We had a lovely time. We came back on the ferry to Invercargill, and we were going to stay overnight in a hotel in Invercargill. All planned, all paid for. And in the afternoon, as we got back, I had this strong feeling, this strong thought, I should ring my husband. I said to the ladies, I feel like I should ring Harry. I said, oh, no, you're going to see him by tomorrow afternoon. No, he'll be fine. Don't ring him. Well, I feel like I should ring Harry. No, forget about him. This is our girls' outing. Come on, don't worry about your husband, blah, blah, blah. And so she did not ring her husband. She got back that afternoon and found her husband dead in the house. And when they did, the doctor came and checked. He said, oh, he died in the very early evening the previous day. And she thought, maybe that's why God was prompting me. If I rang him and he said, oh, I'm feeling lousy, I could have called someone to go and check on him. He might still be alive today if I'd called him that afternoon. Now, as she tells me this story, she's becoming very teary, and she's obviously bearing a lot of pain and guilt. And I said something like, would you like help to be free from some of all that? She said, no, it's fine. Time heals. Now, she was in deep pain. She was feeling grief and guilt for something like 6 years. And there was freedom for her. But she would not admit her need. No, it's going to be fine. Time heals. And I sat there thinking, I really could help you. God's helped me. I'd love to help you. But I'm not going to insult you by telling you that you're stupid or that you've got the wrong end of the stick. I'm a guest in your home. I can't be impolite and rude to you. And so got up the next day, had a nice breakfast, said goodbye and went away. And left her in her pain, because time does not heal those kind of pains. You might find better coping skills or better mechanisms or better ways of bluffing yourself, but the pain is still there. Like I said, with my beetroot face and my tears, I conquered that for at least 6 years, but it wasn't conquered. It was just managed and suppressed and tucked away somewhere. It was still there. So admit your need is a really, really important thing. I want you to notice a couple of scriptures here. And we resist God if that we fear he's going to hurt us or not show mercy. And I've given you that verse, Isaiah 42, a bruised reed he will not break, the smoking ember he will not put out, he will bring forth true judgment. And then remember Jeremiah 29:11. It's a wonderful verse that often gets quoted. I know my thoughts toward you. Good thoughts, thoughts for your peace and not evil, to give you a good outcome. So God's plans are good, and we might be afraid to admit to God that we've got a need, afraid of the embarrassment, afraid of the pain, afraid of the humiliation. But God wants you to be free, and the first step is for you to admit that you've got a need. My reaction most of the time was to say, hey, I'm a Christian. At least I go to church. I carry a Bible under my arm. I know Bible verses from memory. There are people down the street. I go to school with them, and they're ratbags, and they lie and they cheat. Pick on them. And I was pushing God away, saying, I'm good enough. Leave me alone. Go and work on the people that are a harder case than me. But out of God's love, he wanted to set me free. And he did, praise God, over a period of time. So here is a prayer. I said that I want you to do it, to practice these steps. This is now the do it for step number 1. You've identified, I trust, something that you know you need to deal with. Maybe you've known about it for a long time, but you've picked something that we're going to use. I want you now to admit your need to God in regard to that thing. Lord, I admit that I cannot solve this issue. I humble myself and accept I do have a problem and I can't keep hiding it or running away from it. I'm not as good as or capable as I want to be. I'm hurting and broken and I need your love and grace in my life. That's your starting point. If you say, well, I've got this problem, but it's not as bad as people think it is. I think most of the time it's them anyway. You're not going to get free. Right? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes for you quietly. Ignore the people around you and just quietly pray that prayer maybe as a starting point and just say, Lord, I think about this thing. I think about what happened. I really do need to be free. Can you take a moment or two to do that, friends? Now, I want to talk to you at length here about identifying, this is step 2, identifying the real issues. If you were to go to a doctor and say, I've got this pain in my shoulder, right? Well, the doctor could say, oh, yes, okay. Well, that could have been from an injury, right? Have you ever been injured? Have you been using it lately? And then he would go through a series of questions. It could be a heart attack. It could even be a problem with your kidney or your spleen. It could be blood pressure related. It could be neurological, the nervous system. It could actually be from a whole bunch of different things. And so your problem is not that you've got pain in the shoulder. Your problem is something else that is causing the pain in your shoulder. So when we identify the real issue, we want to dig past what's on the surface. So you could say, for instance, what's your problem? I get angry a lot. Okay. So your problem is anger. Well, maybe it isn't anger. Maybe the anger is only on top of something like deep-seated resentment or fear of failure or something else. So in order to be the most wonderfully set free, we need to let God show us what we're really dealing with. Think about James and John. They're Jesus' disciples. They're going along as a group of disciples walking, and they go into this part of Israel called Samaria. And as they go through Samaria, they send off some of the disciples to the village to buy food, and the people say, we're not serving you because you're Jews. And they came back and said to Jesus, we can't buy anything here. They won't serve us because we're Jews. And James and John said, hey, we could call down fire from heaven and burn up the whole village. Now, they thought that was a good idea. They were pretty excited about that. Jesus is going to be so happy with us. We came up with a really good idea. But what do you reckon that was? Don't you think maybe it was racial prejudice on their part? Those Samaritans challenge us. Well, we'll show them that we've got a bigger stick than they have. It was based on something wrong. And so sometimes we don't realize the real issue. Jesus said to them, you don't realize the spirit that's controlling you. And then Mary and Martha. We find that Martha is busy cooking food for the disciples, and Mary goes in and sits on the floor in front of Jesus and just listens to everything that he's saying. And Martha comes out and says, Jesus, you tell her to get into the kitchen and help me, because there's a lot of work to be done and she's not doing any of it. And Jesus did not support that. He said, no, she's made a wise choice. I'm not going to take that away from her. Martha had a bad attitude. She probably felt like, because I'm the older sister, guess who always gets to do the work? She had issues in here of her own. And the situation with Mary brought that to the surface. So as God brings things to the surface in your life, we need to find out what it is that's really going on. We want to find out what was, if possible, the initiating event, the root cause. Was there a trigger? Was there a starting point? Is it a family issue maybe? Has it come down through the generations? Is there a curse or a blight? So if someone came to me and said, Pastor Chris, I've got a problem with anger, I would usually ask the question, do you know where that came from? They'd probably say, no, been this way all my life. Okay. Was there a time when you weren't angry, like when you were 3? Oh, I wasn't angry when I was 3. When you were 7? No, I wasn't angry when I was 7. In primary school? No. Well, maybe toward the end of primary school. Well, what happened toward the end of primary school that might have changed that? Oh, yeah. It was those boys. And suddenly we're now getting close to understanding that there was some kind of trigger point, some kind of starting point that got that thing happening. Or somebody might say, hey, my dad's angry, my brothers are angry, my uncles are angry, my granddad was angry. We're all just angry. Well, now we know that there's some kind of spiritual influence coming down through the generations. As God warned his people that he visits the iniquities down through the generations for 3 and 4 generations. So that's a long time for problems to be happening in a person's life. How many people here knew their great-great-granddad? Nobody. Anybody know your great-granddad? No. Did you know your own granddad? Maybe yes. But so a couple of generations back there, you probably don't have much idea at all about what they are like. Yet you could be suffering because of their selfishness, their foolishness, the evil in their lives. And so if that's the case, we want to break the generational curse. We want to break that situation. So we want to identify the real issue. There's a number of stories I've used over and over again. You may have heard them before if you've heard me before. But let me tell you about 3 young women who this is a made-up story, but it gives the picture of what's happening. Imagine that I'm pastoring a church, and on a particular Sunday, 3 women come to church who've never been to church in all their life, and all 3 of them become Christians. Wonderful. And then the next week they come and say, Pastor Chris, we need some help. Oh, yes? What's your problem? Well, we're all the same age. We've been friends all the way through high school, and we all became Christians a week ago, and we all are cigarette smokers, and we don't want to be cigarette smokers. So can you pray a prayer for us to set us free from cigarette smoking? I can say, well, I can do that. We've got 3 women, all the same age. They all have the same problem. I say, when did you start smoking? Oh, we all started when we were 16. This looks like 3 copies of the same thing. Looks like the same, each one. So I say to the first girl, why did you start smoking? She said, well, my parents were smokers, and I love the smell of cigarette smoke. I think I was probably addicted when I was in the womb, because my mother was smoking constantly, even when she was pregnant. And one of my favorite things to do when we were watching television was I'd go and stand behind my dad. He'd sit in the lounge chair and he'd be smoking, and I'd go breathing in the smoke from his smoking. I think I've had nicotine in my blood from the day I was born. or before then. So now her problem then sounds like it's maybe chemical, nicotine addiction. And she said, oh, my parents told me that you must not smoke. They didn't want me to end up like them. They didn't know I already was. And at midnight, on the day that I turned 16, 1 minute past 12, I already had the cigarette waiting beside my bed. I got it out and I lit it up. I had my first puff when I was 1 minute old in my 16th year. Okay, I did that because I had then had my parents' permission. Okay, so we've got a problem. Someone with nicotine issues. Okay, I say to the second girl, why did you start smoking? Well, when we were 16, we were going to school, we were all just hanging around together, and one of the guys came along with a car, and he pulled up beside us and said, hey, come on, we'll drive you down to the milk bar and we'll all get a Coke. Come on. And they said, but you can't come in the car unless you're prepared to smoke. My other girlfriend, who was already smoking, jumped into the car. I said, come on. I said, no, I'm not going to smoke. My parents said if they ever caught a cigarette in my hand, they'd break my fingers. I fear my father. I have no intention of facing his wrath. I will not smoke cigarettes. Oh, come on. And day after day, I would be walking on my own and the car would pull up with my friends. And they'd all be saying, come on. And finally, one day, I weakened. I climbed onto the car, said, well, give me the cigarette, and took one puff just to make them happy. And I've been addicted to cigarettes ever since. What is her underlying problem? It's not nicotine addiction. She gave her will over to her friends. She let her friends take her will off her and tell her what to do. And she's probably had issues with a weak will ever since. So now I've got to pray with her differently to praying for the first girl who's got nicotine addiction. No good just dealing with nicotine addiction. She's got issues in her heart where she compromised a sacred thing that God gave her that's going to take her to heaven or hell, called her will. And that's a pretty serious thing to compromise. Okay? So I say to the third girl, I say, when did you start smoking? Well, when I was 16, turned 16, my girlfriend who just turned 16 came along and said, I can smoke now. I'm 16. It was wonderful. And I thought, wow, yes. I hate my father. And there's one thing he hates is cigarettes. So I borrowed a cigarette off my girlfriend. I went home from school and we sat down for dinner and I made sure I sat beside my father. And at a certain point in the meal, I got up and went into the kitchen. I lit the cigarette and I sucked in a lungful of smoke and I went and sat down beside my father and I blew it in his face. And he went wild and he chased me out of the house. And I felt so good to be able to spite my father. Tell me, is her problem nicotine addiction? It's bigger than that, isn't it? There's something in her heart of hatred, some unresolved pain between her and her father, unforgiveness, bitterness in her heart toward her dad. She is a toxic woman, and it's not the cigarettes. It's a much bigger issue than that. Right? So, in order for me to help these three women, I've got to pray for each of them completely separately and different because their situations are completely different. So in your case, in whatever it is that you have felt God would prompt you to have as your focal point for this, what's the real issue? When did the problem actually begin? Why did it begin? What happened? How did you respond? What was going on in your life that caused you to end up in that situation? Identify the real issue. Now, sometimes we can't identify the real issue. But I want you to recognize that it's not the circumstances that are the problem. Your heart response is the problem. I want you to take you to Proverbs chapter 4. Solomon tells us, keep your heart diligently because out of your heart come all of the issues of life. And then Jesus was talking about evil things and he said, all this evil comes from within, out of the heart of man. And so the real issues that you've got to deal with ultimately are the issues of your heart, not just the circumstances. You know, you can have 3 children growing up in the same family and the father loses all of the money gambling And they get thrown out of the house and they end up living in a caravan park, and the dad becomes a drunkard because he feels so bad about himself. And the kids grow up with this horrible situation. One moment everything was fine, next minute everything is terrible. And one of the kids says, well, that's life. One of the other kids said, it's Dad's fault, and I hope he burns in hell. I never want him to have a happy moment for the rest of his life because he's ruined mine. What's the difference? Circumstances are the same. The difference is in the heart response. And so you've got to recognize that when things happen around you, you say, well, it's the circumstances that have made me annoyed. You say, no, it's your heart that is getting annoyed. The circumstances are just the circumstances. Now it's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying you shouldn't have been better treated. I'm not saying that you should not have gone through the horrible things you went through. But your heart is the heart of the matter. So as you identify the real issue, look at the matter of what's happening in your heart. Now, sometimes the exact origin may be hidden. It may have been inherited. It may have come by some other means. You may have been circumstances you've forgotten all about. You didn't even realize they were that important. So ask God to reveal your issues. I had a situation many years ago as a young married man where I was able to go and help a family where there was a boy with grand mal epilepsy issues. And I was talking with the boy as we were dealing with the spiritual issues and a demon in his life. And I knew I had to get back to where this demon had come into his life that was causing these physical problems for him. And I said to him, have you ever been involved in witchcraft or something? He looked at me a bit blankly. I said, well, have you had your fortune told or looked in a crystal ball? And suddenly he had this look of thing, and he also had this really dark look. Like, I said, what aren't you telling me? I need to know what's going on. He said, well, in their mid-high school years, they had a school fete, and there was a tent there where there was a fortune-telling woman who sat at a chair and had a crystal ball in front of her. And he said, I went into the tent of the fortune teller. I said, what did she say? Oh, there was no way he was going to tell me what she told him. He was afraid. Whatever she'd said to him was horrifying him, and it brought a terror and a demonic spiritual presence into his life. And I said, I want you to know this. If it came from the devil, it's a liar, because he's the father of lies. Whatever that woman said to you is not true. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And the devil has told you lies in order to bind you up. And I led him through a prayer to ask God to forgive him and to deal with it in different ways. The steps to release I'm showing you here. And he was wonderfully set free that night. So he didn't realize, he would not have connected his sickness and the struggles he was having with having gone into a fortune teller's tent. But by the time we finished praying over it and cast that thing out of his life and he was normal and free, there was clearly, that was the connection, right? So it may be that the exact origin is hidden from you. You don't know what it was that actually caused this issue to come into your life. Ask God to reveal it. That's in line with what David prayed, Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, test me, and know my thoughts, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So as we identify the real issues, we may have to just simply ask God to show us what's going on. Ask God to reveal the real issue, not just the surface issue, the real issue underneath it. Be humble and accept what God shows you. And then let God search your heart and reveal things that he wants to lovingly free you from. So we're now going to do it. We're going to do this step of applying step number 2. If you cannot immediately identify where the problem came from, then pray this prayer. Say, God, this is the issue that you've prompted me. I'm following through with this. I can't know where it came from. Show me. Let God show you. But be humble and accept what he shows you. And let God search your heart and reveal things that he wants to lovingly free you from. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to just stop and do that right now. Would you do that for your own good? Praise God. Well, I trust you've had some sense of clarity about that as we identify the real issue? Because that becomes a platform for us now as we move into step number 3.